Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me once again on GB News Originals. I'm Neil Oliver. My guest today is a familiar face, certainly familiar to me, Ralph Schoellhammer, professor, podcaster, and a commentator, and an insightful commentator at that, on things political and social. Lovely to see you, Ralph.
Lovely to see you, Neil. I feel a little bad, like we meet so often online, and I always say I'm going to come visit you, and I never have, but I promise this is about to change very soon.
Very good. I will definitely look forward to that. To make the most of the time with you, I'll get straight into it, Ralph, if I may. I'm looking on, particularly, we're both inhabitants of Europe one way or another, and I'm looking at the Balkans today, and it seems to me there's a potential powder keg there. Russia, as always, is seeking warm water ports on its southern flank. China is in the vicinity in connection with trade routes. The US is prowling. British NGOs are all over the place in that part of the world. It seems to me we might be just one false flag away from something happening in the Balkans, spreading elsewhere in that time-honoured fashion in that part of the world. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think you're very right on this. I mean, the Balkans have historically very often, for multiple reasons, been a focal point when, let's say, geopolitical tensions tended to heat up. And very often, interestingly enough, and this is why I think that this comparison is very appropriate, the original place of tension is very quickly forgotten as then the broader picture unfolds. I mean, there is a very famous book by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. I mean, there are many, I think, contemporary scholars of World War I that don't like it much, and I think they have good reasons to be critical of it. I overall still think it's an interesting read. But the reason why I bring it up is because she describes the causes and the domino effects that led to the breakout of World War I. But the actual most imminent reason, at least in hindsight or for the contemporaries, was, of course, the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But that is mentioned about 2 or 3 times in her book in passing, because her argument, among others, is that it was the larger situation that then just was, if you will, condensed in this one event that then led to the, let's say, which was the spark that blew up the powder keg, but everything was already in place. So it could have been anything. And I believe if we look at many of the contemporary things that are unfolding in the world, including the war in Ukraine, and to be very clear, I don't have to tell this to you, Neil, but also for your audience, everything we say here is not trying to make light of human suffering or to relativize the things that are going on. But that being said, I believe that given at least contemporary trends, a lot of this, what we will see in the future is they will say, okay, what started in Ukraine was the Franz Ferdinand moment, if you will. But of course, that the things that are at stake, if you will, are much bigger. And I think, and we will go into this, I'm sure, in our conversation, I think you can already see this in the behavior of other players in this. I mean, take, for example, the recent meeting in Beijing between India, China, and Russia. I don't think that the Chinese or the Indians are particularly fond of Ukrainian suffering. But I think what they do is that they see the bigger geopolitical picture. So despite their, I'm sure, empathy and moral understanding of the issues of this conflict and the human suffering, of course, they also see the bigger picture and say, okay, how is the global chessboard, if you want, of great power competition set up, and what can we do, and how do we have to position ourselves, both in relation to the United States, but also in relation to Russia. And very often, which is the cynical nature of politics, war and human suffering are a secondary thought to the larger setup of how a nation wants to position itself.
And you obviously, I was going to move on to that meeting between Xi Jinping and Modi and Putin. President Trump's response to, or is the mood music he has created against which events are unfolding, seems so futile and so pointless. The constant talk of sanctions, counter sanctions, sanctions against people who trade with Russia. The way in which he has, in a way that might not have happened otherwise, driven India into the arms of BRICS by his actions. Britain, after years of wanting to, finally struck a trade deal with India. And now Trump seems to be insisting that they counter-sanction, to try and get India back where President Trump wants them. None of it seems like any kind of sophisticated, far less intelligent behaviour in relation to the new reality of multipolarity rather than traditional US hegemony.
No, I think you're right. And particularly when it comes to India, I believe that Donald Trump is being very ill-advised by whoever it is, particularly regarding what you just mentioned, sanctions and also the tariffs. The original approach, as I saw it, and we talked about this on your show, by the Trump administration to use tariffs, to use certain pressure techniques, which they're still doing, to create this integrated Western hemisphere-based economic sphere, I think is still an interesting idea. Now, whether it's going to work out or not, this is a separate issue. But I think, as you just said, that is something where I do see a somewhat sophisticated strategy. Now, that being said, even if you build your own block in this multipolar world, or let's call it, even if you build your own pole in this multipolar world, you still want to make sure that you don't drive others into the arms of the competing side. Now, and again, I'm not making a moral argument. Like, for me, this truly is like a chess game. So I'm not saying this, side A is good, side B is bad. I'm just saying, given the existing conditions, what would be a potentially smart move and what would be a potentially not so smart move? And as you correctly pointed out so eloquently, driving India into the arms of Russia and China is not a smart move, because they are, both in population, but I think also in other areas, also from geographic location and potential, a very interesting, a very important player. And you'd rather have them on your side than on the other side. Now, that being said, maybe two more points. One is the United States have been a little bit my English was good. Duplicitous. They were dishonest. I think that's a better way than to put it, since I cannot manage this very complicated English word. Because Trump is now basically accusing the Indians, or threatening them also with so-called secondary sanctions, because they buy oil from Russia and other things, and their, let's say, more warm relations with Moscow. But at the same time, and I read this just recently in an Indian newspaper, but it's heatedly debated within India, right? The Indians remember that Joe Biden, of course, then also the US president, or let's put it different, the sock puppet who pretended to be the US president, but whoever was having his hand up, Joe Biden, was asking the Indians behind closed doors to continue to buy Russian oil, because if the Indians buy oil in Russia and not somewhere else, that keep prices below a crucial point, which would have been a problem for the American economy. So the Indians now say, okay, fine. A couple of years ago, in living memory, a very short time ago, you asked us in secret, continue to buy Russian oil because we want to keep oil prices low. And now you go out there and say, it's an outrage. The Indians buy oil from Russia. So the Indians are not stupid. Modi is definitely not stupid. And I think he was expecting more from Trump 2.0. And the second point is, during this meeting in Beijing, both Modi and Putin retreated to their armored limousine for a 50-minute conversation. Now, the reason why they used this limousine is because, as far as I know, that's the best place to be secure from eavesdropping. Now, you can imagine that Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi, they were not just exchanging pleasantries during that conversation. And 50 minutes between two statesmen of that caliber, that's a long time for a one-on-one conversation. So I do not know what they have been talking about, but I can speculate a few things that they have been talking about. So one thing I would not have been surprised is that the Indians are curious to inquire, how did the Russians build their economy that it has been so capable of resisting Western sanctions, which it has been. Now, I'm not saying that the sanctions had not hurt the Russians, but it hasn't broken them. And that was originally the goal by these sanctions, or those who proposed those sanctions. The second point I could imagine is that Russia is proposing to play a mediating role when it comes to the border conflicts or the unresolved territorial issues between India and China, which, if you look at a map, they are serious, but I don't think they're unresolvable. So I think there is something that can be done. And I'm sure they had other issues like energy cooperation and other issues to discuss as well. But it has become very clear that India at the moment is trending towards China and Russia. And when then Donald Trump issues a tweet where he says, I don't remember the precise words, where he said, India is joining the dark duo, or the dark path with China and Russia. That sounds good, but diplomacy is more than tweets. And I think he backpedaled it when he all of a sudden then said, he has such warm feelings and admires Modi and India so much. So apparently either he himself or somebody told him, listen, this is not going in a good direction, because a unified bloc, forget all then the larger countries that would also arrange themselves around this bloc, but the unified bloc of Russia, China, and India, I mean, that's an opposing force you don't want to have as your opponent. So you need to break India or Russia out of this triad. And at the moment, Western policy, by the way, the Europeans are just as bad, is more designed to bring them closer together. And I think that's, as you said before, that is the consequence of a not very sophisticated foreign policy.
Do you think it's gone even further? We could continue to speculate that it's an ongoing game of chicken. That, as you say, regardless of notions of good guy, bad guy, and just trying to look at it in cold-bloodedly political and economic terms. For example, the deal that's there between Russia and China to send Russian energy east. After the blow up of the Nord Stream pipeline, Europe and the West is cut off from Russian energy. Now with that multi-billion-pound deal to send that Russian energy into the east, it almost feels as if a Rubicon has been crossed. And that block between India, Russia and China, it's where most of the world's population lives. And it's trillions of rubles and yen and the rest of it's worth of yuan's worth of GDP. If it is a game of chicken, to some extent, it almost feels as if the US has already lost it. Because to what extent does that bloc, that emergent bloc, even need the West and America if America is just going to keep on playing this version of hardball all the time?
Well, that's a good question, and we now outlined a little bit, and we can do this a little long. I think there are some additional factors here that you already alluded to, particularly the Power of Siberia pipeline that, as it looks at the moment, has had now full commitment by everybody involved. I mean, they talked about this in the past, but apparently China was demanding such a low price for the energy that was supposed to be delivered that the Russians backtracked. But apparently now the deal is made and it's going to happen. This is, by the way, a catastrophe for Europe, including the UK, because all the energy that was once and could hypothetically in the future have been dealt and exported to Europe is now most likely in the future going to China. Now, one can say, oh, why should Europe care, or why should the UK care about this? We don't get that much gas from Russia and energy from Russia anyways. That is true, but it's a global market. So what this means is that more and more countries in Europe then will depend, for example, on Norway. But Norway is already stretched quite thin. And by the way, when I mean this, I'm not just talking about gas, I'm also talking about electricity. I mean, this is something I don't know how many of your viewers know this, but without the interconnecting cable that connects the UK and Norway, Britain would be in massive, massive electricity troubles. And there is an election in Norway next week, or by the end of this week, if I'm not mistaken, but very soon within the next 8 to 10 days, where the government collapsed because all the Europeans, inclusively the Germans, they were sucking so much electricity out of Norway through these connecting cables that prices skyrocketed in Norway. So the government collapsed because the opposing parties and those who supported the coalition government said, no, we need to get out of the unified electricity market in Europe because this is wrecking our economy. Now, it looks as if the pro-European side is going to win the election, but it shows you that it has been enough to cause snap elections in Norway, even though the powers that have been will remain in power. That might not be the case the next time. So as we move down a spiral of cutting ourselves off from energy supplies, this is just going to get worse. And just to make this more interesting for your British viewers, I mean, I think in most ways what Ed Miliband does is a violation of Britain's national interest. So this idea, and we talked about this before, but this must be stressed enough. If you depend on pretty much every key element of energy, including fossil fuels, but also electricity itself, from Norway or from other countries, of course, you expose yourself to blackmail, which makes complete sense. Every nation would do this. And this is what the Europeans don't understand. They don't have leverage. They don't have leverage vis-a-vis Russia. They don't have leverage vis-a-vis China. And I would say they don't have leverage vis-a-vis India. Now, with the United States, because you asked a very important question, have they already lost? And does the other side still need them? Well, the United States, based on what I can read in their current policies, they could ask the same question. I mean, just to give a quick example, if we remain within the sphere of energy, Venezuela, as far as we know, has the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves. The US government is getting much more belligerent towards Venezuela. And this is not just, or if at all, because of human rights. This is about the energy resources. We know that Brazil, even though Brazil currently is trending towards the BRICS bloc, I mean, it is, after all, the B in BRICS. And Lula has recently said that he wants to intensify military cooperation with China. I would argue that this is probably not going to happen. And let me give you a quick anecdote, because this is the amazing thing about the world we live in at the moment. So some of you have probably seen that the U.S. military was taking out a speedboat or a small boat of a Mexican drug cartel. Now one would say, okay, this is just the United States getting tough on the drug cartels, which I'm sure that's part of the story. But there's of course a larger message there as well. This one mainly directed at Mexico, but of course I would say that it includes Brazil as well. That the United States say, listen, we can intervene in all kinds of ways in your countries very, very quickly in a way that Chinese can't. So if Brazil says we want to cooperate closer with China, that's all well and good. But China at the moment, despite them being very powerful, and I think they're permanently underestimated, but that does not change the fact that there are certain things at the moment that Chinese cannot do, right? They don't have a global navy. They don't have a strike capacity pretty much at any place on the globe within 24 hours. This, for the moment, is still the monopoly of the United States. And this monopoly is particularly strong in their quote-unquote backyard. I know that's a little bit of a derogatory term, but you know what I mean, in their vicinity, let's put it this way. And I think this was not just a signal to Mexico, and the Mexicans have severed their relations with the Chinese. For example, an electric car factory that was planned has been postponed. There are other signs that the Mexicans will fall much more in line with US policy. And I think the US approach is now to show to all of Latin America that this is the way to go, or else. Now, Argentina has voluntarily, I would argue, under Milei signed up with the pro-American camp, which again, I'm not making a moral judgment here. So also for your viewers, this is not me making the case for America or making the case for China. This is just me trying to interpret all these bits and pieces that plop up on the screen and see how they are connected and if they are connected. And I think many of them are. And at the end of the day, and this is what the conflict in Ukraine has shown, hard power still matters, right? The ability to strike in whatever way, shape, or form, be it via cyber attacks, be it via drones, be it via rockets, be it via special forces, you name it, that still makes a difference. So even the Brazilian government knows if the United States signals to them, listen, in the past, we more or less let everybody do what they want, but those times are over. So if you side up with the Chinese, we might be tempted to use whatever methods we have at our disposal to bring you back in line. You might want to think about with whom you side up, and I think that is a powerful message. If this coercion, and that is ultimately what it is, should be successful, and you truly get what I still think is ultimately Trump's plan, you get this integrated economic sphere from the southern tip of South America up to Alaska, including Canada, and potentially in not an occupation, but some other way, Greenland, so this entire basically piece of land. That would be quite the powerful bloc, both in manpower, energy resources, natural resources, that should not be underestimated. And I think there is a strong force within the United States. So like this super isolationists who said, just America is enough. But I think then there are the, let's call them semi-isolationists who say, we don't want to have a footprint everywhere from the Middle East to the Pacific, but the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, Alaska, Greenland, this is something where we really want to make sure that it's us who are calling the shots. And that is not an unrealistic strategy. And by the way, just real quick, you see this unfolding in other areas as well. For example, if the United States all of a sudden, or if the government takes out shares or takes a stake in US mining companies, if the chip maker Intel now has handed over a 10% share to the US government. I mean, this clearly shows you, right, that the state, both in the United States and elsewhere, is getting more and more and more involved in the areas of the economy, in industries that they see critical for national power, national security, and global influence. And I think there is this great game is afoot, and it is too soon. I know it's a very long answer, but it's too soon to say who really has the most leverage. So it's going back and forth, right? And we will, by the way, we will see players who shift sides. I don't think that the Indians, for example, as much as they signal now their approval towards India and China, towards Russia and China, I don't think that this will be for them a life and death alliance. I can very much imagine that if the United States changes course, then all of a sudden the Indians swivel back a little bit, that they try to play a little bit of a balancing act, right? They're not really in one camp, they're not really in the other camp, they're like a bridge, if you want, between those two, which would be a great role for India to play. Now, I think to the benefit of everybody involved. But there's a lot going on, and every analyst who claims that they exactly know what's going to happen over the next 6 to 18 months, I think you can always be lucky in your guesses, but I think it's a liar, because there are so many moving parts and pieces at the moment that it's very, very difficult to make reliable predictions, which, and this is truly my last point, I think also explains why gold keeps going up or had this rally in recent months, because when times are insecure, when they're uncertain, when you really cannot have a probability attached to what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, you say, I'm not so much after a significant return on my investments or savings. I just want to make sure that the savings I have are, well, safe. And gold has always been a safe haven. So I think this is a very good indicator for uncertainty, is when more and more people kind of shift out of currencies and shift into things like gold.
To get back to things British, all of these, I'm here in the British Isles, and GB News Prime, focus is in that which affects Britain directly. And I listen to other commentators who aren't really present on the mainstream, people like Alex Craner, people like Tom Longo, who comment on what's going on. And both I've heard recently predicting that Britain will be the first domino to fall. They're looking on at the gilt, the bond price. Your British bonds are less trusted than anybody else's. Yeah, the fact that we in Britain are paying energy prices that are by orders of magnitude greater than any other country in Europe. And there's this prediction that Britain is about to fall, and that when that domino falls, that others might go along with it. But what do you make of that? Do you think Britain is the most exposed, the most at risk, because of so many of the factors that we've discussed already?
Oh, I sometimes like to make this comparison. It's not yet perfect. I have to refine it. I hope your viewers will forgive me. But what I call a reverse 1917. So, right in 1917, you had it was the Germans, but you had the Germans fighting the Russians, and in Russia there was a revolution. And I think the now more likely scenario is with the Russians fighting a proxy war against NATO and the West in Ukraine, that many countries in the West are much closer to revolutionary conditions than the Russians. And I would absolutely put Britain on the top of that list. Now, whether it's going to be the financial market, well, we have a vote of no confidence, or most likely in Paris, in France today, regarding the minority government there. So that's going to be an issue for the euro. The same, I think, is true with the pound in the UK. But what I see unfolding, which I have my eye on, is more the risk of civil unrest and potential civil war-like scenarios in the UK. I mean, what you saw happen over the last couple of weeks, the kind of frustration, the pent-up anger within significant parts of the British population, I think it will only take, and this brings us back to what we originally started talking about, the Balkans, right? What the Balkans were for global geopolitics, I think is a little bit on a smaller scale what we see in the UK, like one more Southport, or one more, as you say, or maybe a significant break-in of the economy. I think that would be enough of a spark to really, really cause something unprecedented for basically centuries in the United Kingdom. I mean, the whole, and again, I'm sure that many of you have followed this. I followed it from abroad, and I actually liked it very much. show your flag. I forgot the precise name. This initiative of people raising wherever possible the St. George's cross, and the reaction by the authorities. I mean, the British government at the moment is terrified of the British people, and that you now have with the resignation of Angela Rayner that you make somebody the Home Secretary who, let's say, is at least doubtful in her full commitment to Britain and to Britishness. I know this seems like sketchy terms, but I think they're important and they're real. I mean, this is a tone deafness and the risk that the Starmer government is taking here that I find almost, brinking on the absurd. And we're going to have, I think there's a big rally in London on September 13th, the United Kingdom rally. I think that this is something that Douglas Murray has been saying, and I think this is something where he's probably onto something. I think that November 11th this year is going to be very interesting in Britain. If there is again, whatever you think about the conflict itself, but if there is again, let's say, a wave of pro-Palestinian protests on November 11th, and I mean this independently of what's going on in the Middle East, but I think there's just a growing number of people in Britain who say we don't want foreign flags on our territory. And we definitely don't want it on a day like November 11th, where we commemorate the people who fought and died for Britain, the British Empire, and, King and Queen and all that. So there is a very high risk that once this thing starts rolling, I think it's very difficult to stop it again. And we have a good comparison for this. Not a perfect one, but nobody believed in the Arab Spring or that the Arab Spring could happen until one vegetable and fruit vendor set himself on fire. And probably like he set himself on fire literally, but then pretty much the entire Middle East and North Africa was going up, well, both literally and metaphorically in fire, and no one of those regimes could stop it. And I think the same could happen in the UK as well. Once you have unrest and dissatisfaction reach a certain level, all kind of things can happen. And again, I'm not advocating it, but I'm acknowledging the possibility. And just to kind of push this a little further, if you would have told anybody in 1988 that in 1990 the Iron Curtain would be gone, and in 1992 the Soviet Union would have ceased to exist, everybody would have called you crazy. But so who are we to say that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years there won't be a revolution or a revolution-like situation in the UK and in Germany and in France? I mean, I just think that the UK is high up on the list, but they're not alone on this list. So I think this very Western idea, there we can connect it to this broader geopolitical question we're discussing. There is this sort of Western arrogance where we believe it's some kind of law of nature, that the West will always be dominant and hegemonic, and that our political systems will always be the most prosperous, most stable, and most legitimate. But that's not the case. I mean, Emmanuel Macron, to use another example in France, I mean, his approval rating is 15%. I would argue that, his legitimacy is very low, and he's the one guy who constantly, travels the world and speaks about sending 150,000 Europeans to Ukraine. I mean, it's not going to happen, I assume. But first of all, the idea is ludicrous. But if it would happen, can you imagine the scene if you would have dead soldiers in coffins come back from the Donbass, and they'd be British soldiers, French soldiers, German soldiers? How many people would take that? How many people in France would say, we have a government, and this is true for all Western European governments, we have a government that cannot ensure its basic, or cannot fulfill its basic duties. The streets are not safe. The streets are getting dirty. Infrastructure is not working. Crime is high. We feel that they care about every culture, every civilization more than our own. And now they also want us to die in a foreign war, to paraphrase Neville Chamberlain, like in a faraway country of which we know little. This is, as I said, there are dynamics at play currently in the West that make us much, much more unstable than, let's say, China, Russia, or India. Now, sure, with China, it's always difficult because we cannot really get an insight into the inner workings of a regime like that. But I don't have the sense, if it happens tomorrow, I'm the first one to admit that I was wrong. But they don't strike me as being on the brink of a revolution. But as I said before, like the same thing was true for the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. But in the late 1980s, despite all the troubles, you remember the 1970s in the UK were not a particularly great time. But and you had the strikes and all of this. But I would argue that there was still a general acceptance that the system that is in place is the right one. It just doesn't work perfectly anymore. But I think we have a growing share of the population, I would include myself in it, that says the system itself is becoming the problem. And then, of course, we talk about a completely different revolution, a potentially revolutionary energy.
Is this then, it's almost rhetorical, I suppose, but is this what explains the continued demonstrable Western European leader obsession with war with Russia?
Oh, absolutely.
It's all they've got. All these things that you've listed and the precarious position in which they find themselves. If Donald Trump or by whatever means peace broke out in Ukraine, where would that leave the Euro-weenies like Starmer, like Macron, like Ursula von der Leyen at the EU Commission? Merz,
I think you're 100% right, and I think you're very right, and I think what's currently happening is also partially cruel. Now, take for example this meeting that was supposed to create this coalition of the willing in Paris that was summoned by Emmanuel Macron. I mean, everything that he said there has been rejected by the major players, by the United States, by Russia itself, and by others. There will be no troops in Ukraine. There will be no European troops, but by simply telling Ukraine, we are very close. Who knows? Maybe there will be French troops supporting you. Maybe there will be French troops helping you. Maybe there will, German troops helping you. You act them on to stay in a conflict and bargain higher than they can. Again, as I said before, I completely understand and empathize with the Ukrainian position, but there simply are realities. When I hear Zelensky talking about taking back Crimea, in what world is that going to happen? That is just giving the realities on the ground. That is not going to happen. The military capabilities, both of Ukraine and the kind of support they currently get, will not make this possible. And the other thing, does anybody really believe that Russia would accept any kind of agreement where Western troops would be closer to its border than they were before the outbreak of the war? I mean, this is completely absurd. So the idea that the Russians would say, oh yeah, French troops in the Donbass, that's absolutely fine with us. This is, I have to admit, this is partially madness, what's coming out of the mouth of European politicians, whether it's Macron, whether it's von der Leyen, and others. And when Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, recently gave an interview that says, he is preparing for a long war in Ukraine. So basically he's saying he's preparing for more and more Ukrainians dying in a conflict under current conditions they cannot prevail in. Again, I'm not saying this because I'm happy about this. I'm not saying this because I like or dislike Zelensky. I'm not saying this because I have any grudge against the Ukrainian people. On the contrary, I think that the resistance the Ukrainian people put up was heroic. I think that this was a nation that showed that they want to fight for their independence and their sovereignty. But we cannot deny the fact that they are up against a much more powerful enemy, a much more powerful foe. And in a war of attrition, they are going to lose. And the Russians see it the same way, which is why they are very reluctant. I mean, they never say outright no, but this is why they are reluctant regarding peace negotiations, because they fear or feel, and I think they're not wrong, that they can grind the Ukrainians down. And as I said, I'm not saying this from a moral perspective. I think this is just a political reality we have to face. And if you then have the Germans and the UK and others go out there and speak about what kind of, that they will support, the Ukrainians until victory. What victory? I mean, this is, many people have posted it online, but it is like the Monty Python sketch, right? With the white knight fighting against the black knight, where he cuts off, his arms and everything. And even when the guy is only the torso is left, he says, you fool, I will defeat you in this fight. And this is exactly what we see happen there as well. And I say again, because people say, oh, Ralph, you are Putin's stooge. I'm not anybody's stooge, but I can look at a map. Right, I can look at population numbers. I can look at an economy. I can quote no other than Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, who said, and these are his words, not mine, who said that Russia is producing 4 times as much ammunition as all NATO states together, inclusive the United States. And this is where the conversation for me ends. If your opponent has 4 times as many artillery shells and tanks and drones and whatever is needed than you do, then you cannot prevail in this war. And you're absolutely right. The Europeans, however, kind of answering now your direct question, It's all they have left. This is why every debate immediately swivels to Russia. You say, well, I think von der Leyen is corrupt. You must be siding with the Russians. You say, well, I think that I want to vote for a right-wing party. Yeah, but these right-wing parties are in the pocket of the Russians, because this is the boogeyman they have, and it's the only boogeyman they have left, because if that boogeyman would be gone, their own incompetence would shine even brighter, or the darkness of their incompetence would even be more visible. So you're absolutely right. The Europeans are playing a very dangerous and I have to say cruel game here with the Ukrainians. I'm sure that some of them are well intended, but I think that many know exactly what they're doing, and I think it's atrocious.
Listening to you, Ralph, a person has to wonder how many of us are even able or minded to look back a quarter of a century. And by that, what I'm referring to there is, the Francis Fukuyama end of history notion that was there at the end of the 1990s. Just a quarter of a century ago, the idea that all of this was behind us. This is what we were told. And yet, look at what we're looking at now, right up to and including the Balkans being a powder keg yet again. It's the complete illiteracy, it would appear, on the part of the people making decisions about the reality of history. That we've seen certain ducks in a row, not once or twice, but multiple times. We've seen it before. And it doesn't take any kind of sophistication to look at it and predict, probably very accurately, where these things lead. And yet, here we are again, 25 odd years after Fukuyama said it was the end of history, that everybody just wanted.
I would date it's almost closer to 30 years, because I think the essay, The End of History, he published in 1989. Yeah, and I think the book came out in the mid-90s, but you're right, yeah.
And it makes you wonder, is it possible that the people making these decisions don't know? Or are we looking at something much more cynical or much more hubristic, such that it's, because of that, infinitely more dangerous?
What you have to...
They're aware of the inevitability and they don't care.
You have to tell me, and because I don't want to spread fake news on your show. So I saw this video. I know this is always the most horrible argument you can ever begin this with I saw this video on the internet. But it was about David Lammy was asked a couple of questions. And I think one of them was, he was asked, who was part of discovering radiation. And, instead of Marie Curie, he said Marie Antoinette. That there were a couple of, I forgot the other ones, but I think the video is really, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Yes, it's some appearance in a quiz show. But that's the least of it. And this is David Lammy. This is the man that's a Starmer heartbeat away from leading the country. And he had previously said on live radio that he thinks with hormones a man can grow a cervix. And he was on record in 2015 saying that if it hadn't been for tax credits when he was a child, he would have starved. And then it was pointed out within minutes that he was 31 before the tax credits were introduced. And now he's a heartbeat away from running the country. I mean, he's just he's an example of the kind of, it would appear, grotesque ignorance that we're dealing with.
Oh yeah, and I think this is a much. I see this even as a much bigger problem as any potential conspiracy, because these people think they are very smart, but they are not. Right? I think there was always, not with everyone, but I've grown. The older I get, the fonder I grow of the long 19th century. Because you say what you want about the elites back then and the monarchs, but they were definitely well-read, educated, sophisticated people. That doesn't mean that they didn't make wrong decisions. But even because we started the conversation with the Balkans and a little bit the lead up to World War I, but even if you read the diaries and the comments of so many people in the lead up to World War I, they were not, which is, by the way, a book I highly admire and recommend to everyone, written by the Australian historian who works, I think he's at Cambridge, Christopher Clark, called The Sleepwalkers. It's a great book, but I would only quibble with his term that he calls them sleepwalkers. Like, if you listen to what many politicians at the time said, Germans, Austrians, French, even Russians, they said that if this goes out of hand, like this could destroy European civilization. Like, this could be a war like no other war and the absolute catastrophe of the century. And they were right. I mean, they still did it. Yet this does not alleviates the guilt they have burdened themselves with and the mistakes they made. But these were people who had deep historical understandings. Like these were people when they looked at a map, like when Edward Grey, whatever you think of the man, like when he looked at a map of Europe, he understood what was going on. And I think the same is true for, Bethmann Hollweg and Count Berchtold, and we can go through the entire list of all the politicians at the time. But then, very often they were in the wrong places with the wrong names, where the French ambassador had a German name and the Russian ambassador had a French name. But it was a very sophisticated time for all the mistakes they made. We are not in those sophisticated times anymore. And this brings me back to what you said. We are now living through a period where diplomacy would be so important, where we don't have people who are capable of effective diplomacy. Now, listen, I like Donald Trump. I've been very fond of the man and very positively inclined towards him since 2016 or since 2015 when he came down the escalator. But neither you nor I are members of a cult. So when I see things that I think that he does wrong, or if I see things that I believe are mistakes, I'll point them out. And he has his charms, but he's not a Bismarckian figure when it comes to diplomacy. And that is a problem. I mean, he really believed, I think, I kind of look into the man's head, that if he becomes president, he just has to pick up the phone, call his old friend Vlad, and after 24 hours, everything will be over. So I think he's genuinely disappointed that this war is still grinding on. But the reason why it is still grinding on is because many people do not understand the importance, and that might be unjustified. As again, it's not a moral judgment, but the importance that Ukraine plays in the Russian national imagination. This is again, this is something I believe that for a foreign mind is difficult to understand, but I find it always interesting just to highlight this a little bit. So shortly after the war broke out, you had all these memes on the internet, which they were memes, but there was a kind of truth to it, that Russian civilization took its beginning in Kiev, right? With the Kiev Rus, that actually it was on the territory of Ukraine where Russian civilization had its start. And this was meant to kind of, as a kind of to rally support for Ukraine and as also or as a way to mock Russia. But you can actually read this meme differently as well, which is, well, if Ukraine truly is the starting point of Russian civilization, that shows you how important Ukraine is for Russia, which is why they could never allow them to become part of, a different, cultural, civilizational sphere, because it is the cradle of their civilization, and they don't want to lose it. I mean, you see the same thing, and I don't want to open up that can of worms, but you see the same thing, of course, happening in the Middle East, right? Where the city of Jerusalem, for whatever reason, is so crucial to so many people because they see it as the core of their identity, their civilization. They cannot let go of it. So this is not just, by the way, I also think that, for example, in the Russian case, the NATO argument, I'm sure that the NATO argument was one that was crossing the Russians' mind. But if let's say in 2020, Finland and Sweden would have joined NATO, the Russians would have said, we don't like it, we protested, but they would not have invaded Sweden and Finland. It's different with Ukraine. Now, why is it different with Ukraine? Because in Russia, for better or worse, and maybe this is, again, I'm not saying this because I approve of it. I only acknowledge it, that within the Russian elite and within the Russian nationalist elite, Ukraine is seen as an integral part of Russia, if you want. As I said, I'm not defending it. It's just a fact we have to reckon. And the fact that this is being ignored or this is treated like some superficial element of this, I find astounding. It just brings me back to what you said before. I mean, history throws a long shadow. I think that in Central and Eastern Europe, that shadow is even longer, and it's incredibly long in the Middle East. And this is, I believe, something that many contemporary Western politicians simply do not understand, because I honestly think they don't know the history. I don't think that David Lammy or Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron have ever sincerely engaged with the histories of the areas that they want to meddle in, and I think that's a huge problem.
It is, and it makes me think again of the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin, where, well, it was undeniable that Putin launched off into a 45 or a 60-minute history lesson. Now, if that was just something that he had rehearsed because it was part of the performance that he wanted to give, he nonetheless came across as being a leader who had an intimate interest, a passionate interest in his own country's history, which is very hard to imagine ever hearing coming out of the mouths of anybody in the West at the moment. Anybody.
No. Very true. Very true.
And I'm fascinated, but I'm not sure if it's true. But the anecdote is out there that shortly after the military operation began in Ukraine, Potemkin dispatched special teams to disinter the body of Potemkin from within a burial plot in Ukraine and repatriate it back into Mother Russia. Such was his preoccupation to the nth degree with the significance of Ukraine and Kiev, and very hard to imagine any of that being demonstrated by a Donald Trump or an Emmanuel Macron or a Keir Starmer or any of the rest of them. That interest in his own country and its own legend, if not its history, was there for all to see in the case of Putin.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think this is something because we have in many ways, and this is true for the UK, the continental Europeans as well. We, in a sense, have accomplished the end of history in a way that we simply act as if there is no history. I mean, I had a long conversation, I'm sure you know him, with Carl Benjamin, right, of the Lotus Eaters, and he, I think, made this very good argument that in the Western liberal mind, they treat us as if we are somehow, we are part of a different time and space, so to speak. We're taken out of the ongoings of the world, and we're in a permanent bird's eye position. And that we have completely disconnected ourselves from our own past and our own historical evolution. And I think that's a very, very good observation. We treat these things that are so important to other people, as I said, from Kiev to Jerusalem, and for whatever reason these things are important, but we treat them as if it's not real. But for many people it is real, just as, and I think this is true for you and true for me, as there are many people in the UK for whom the English flag or the British flag or the Scottish flag is real, and not just an anachronism or a symbol of suppression, slavery, and exploitation. And this is something, when I hear then quote unquote intellectuals discussing on British morning shows that we should completely replace and abandon the British flag with something entirely new. I mean, this idea that you simply can restart your country's history from point zero. I mean, we had this before. This is French revolutionary stuff, right? This is exactly what the French revolutionaries thought that they can do. And how did it end? I mean, what was the immediate aftermath after the same in, of course, in the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution? This idea to entirely rewrite and remake a country's history always ends in bloodshed and violence because most people don't want it. And for good reason. I don't want it. I think most of the British people don't want it. But it's forced upon them. And as long as things were going economically acceptably well, not perfect, but acceptably well, I think there was, and as long as you had the sense that things are functioning, as the saying goes, the trains are on time and you can walk through a dark street without being afraid, people were willing to put up with it. But that's also no longer the case. And now there is a sense that most Western governments have completely inverted priorities. I mean, we can go through the entire list. I mean, take the case of Graham Linehan. I'm sure I mispronounced his name, in the UK. So 5 policemen, I'm sure there was, maybe for diversity reasons, I assume there was a policewoman among them as well. So 5 police persons, if I want to be politically correct, were dispatched to pick up a well-known comedian because he made quote-unquote transphobic tweets. Maybe the tweets were transphobic or not. I don't know. I don't care. But this means that 5 police who would be needed to investigate crime, rape, all the actual crimes that matter for people couldn't do that because they had to arrest a comedian. I mean, this is so absurd that at some point our shared friend Mark Stein would say, well, you no longer fear the revolution. You say so it can't happen quickly enough because this is not a free country. Like, this is neither a serious nor a free country anymore. And I think at some point people would say, we've had enough of this.
That's a good note to end on, Ralph. This is neither a free nor a serious country. How succinctly put. As always, Ralph, and I'm already looking forward to our next conversation. But for your insights today, 1,000 thanks.
Thanks so much for having me, Neil. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for watching GB News Originals. I'm Neil Oliver. If you've enjoyed this content, don't forget to click like and subscribe. And please, if you haven't already done so, go to the App Store and download the GB News app.